Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our event today entitled What Caused Iran's Water Bankruptcy? Climate Change, Sanctions, or Bad Management? I'm Nargis Bojogli, an assistant professor at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. Today's event is a part of our Rethinking Iran initiative at SAIS Johns Hopkins, which we began in the spring of 2019. Before I introduce our esteemed speaker for today's event, I'd like to remind everyone of our event coming up this Monday, October 4th at 12 p.m. Eastern Time, entitled Diplomatic and Economic Potential of Iran's New President Raisi. We'll be joined on Monday by Bijan Khwajapour and Esfandiar Batmanqalich, who will join us for what promises to be an engaging and important conversation about the future of Iranian political and economic relations with the new administration in power in Tehran. For today's event, we're very excited to have with us here today Dr. Kaveh Madani. Dr. Madani is an environmental scientist, educator, and activist working on complex human nature systems at the interface of science, policy, and society. He's currently a Rice Senior Fellow at the Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale University, and he's also a visiting professor at the Center for Environmental Policy of Imperial College in London. Dr. Madani previously served as the Deputy Vice President of Iran in his position as the Deputy Head of Iran's Department of Environment, and he's also served as the Vice President of the UN Environment Assembly Bureau and Chief of Iran's Department of Environment's International Affairs and Convention Center. He held different strategic roles during his public service and led Iran's delegation in major intergovernmental meetings and negotiations. He has a PhD in civil and environmental engineering from the University of California in Davis, a master's in water resources from Lund University, and a bachelor in science and civil engineering from the University of Tabriz, and has done his postdoctoral research in environmental economics and policy at the Water Science and Policy Center at the University of California, Riverside. Before I turn over the floor to Dr. Madani, I'd like to invite the audience to ask your questions throughout the event in the chat box on YouTube, and we'll pose those questions to our speaker during the Q&A session. Today's event, Dr. Madani will give a presentation first, followed by some questions from me, and then we'll open up the floor to audience Q&A. Without further ado, I hand over the floor to Dr. Madani.
Thank you for such an extensive, very generous introduction, and thanks for the invitation. It's always a pleasure to talk about Iran. It's unfortunate that most of the times we have to talk about the problems of Iran, especially in the environmental world. I say good night to those who are connecting from Iran. Good afternoon or evening to people in Europe, and early afternoon to people in East Coast. Good morning to people in West Coast, and then probably the rest would be hopefully sleep and won't be bothered by my talk right now. So let me share my slides. Okay, so talking about Iran and Iran's water bankruptcy and what is causing it. I think it's a good time to talk about it because it's the start of the water year. In Iran, water year starts at the beginning of May, beginning of fall. In the West, like we use a different calendar. October 1st, anyway, is the start. So we're at the beginning of the water year, and it is good to think about water. That many of the problems actually that are happening in Iran are not unique to Iran, and they're happening in the rest of the world. And it is good for us to appreciate the complexity involved and understand what is going on. You have all probably heard about the recent protests in Iran that were related to water, and you have read different news articles about it or op-eds about it. And there are different stories that have been told, that have been shared about what is happening in Iran, and everyone has its own interpretation. So that is why this title was chosen. Let's verify things and see what is going on, because a lot is being said about climate change, sanctions, and other things, as well bad management. So let's go and dive into, have a deep dive in Iran's water problems and see what is happening. But as a person who does analyzes complex water human systems or complex human nature systems, there is something that I want to remind everyone. I know there are people who are interested in Iran in general. There are people who are interested in complex environmental systems. There are people who write about Iran, people in media. There are people who analyze Iran in the intelligence system. There are people who don't like the Islamic Republic. There are people who function as apologists of the Islamic Republic. For all these people, I think it is important to understand what is going on and to make sure that they understand the difference between correlation and causation. A lot of times we just use sparse data and have some data points, and then we come up with our own narrative of the problem and try to sell that narrative. The problem with that is that once the narrative is established, it becomes a common belief and it might misguide people. There are many ways to interpret the very same data. And if you are not diving deep into the problem, and if you're not appreciating the real complexities involved, then you can come up with different interpretation. So even if you have data, even if you're talking to your contacts within your network, to people in different parts of the world, in Iran, to different groups, data doesn't always result in giving you enough wisdom about what is happening. Things, of course, become much harder when you can't travel to a place or you cannot go to the field and understand what is happening. Like for many of the people who do Iranian studies in the West and can't really understand what is happening. So then based on limited data, a lot of times we try to generate things, and sometimes, a lot of times, we have a hard time understanding what is happening. So we guesstimate, we speculate, and talk about the things that we really don't know much about. And if the narrative works, people buy it, good for us. But the problem with this sort of approach is that you can come up with a lot of conspiracy theories, especially in complex systems. Conspiracy theories don't always come from the people we don't like. Sometimes we are part of that system. And I strongly believe, at least in when it comes to the water world, as a person who has seen things from inside, in the environmental sector, in the political system, I think a lot of things that we are selling, or we are hearing, at least, are similar to the funny conspiracy theories that are produced by those in charge in Iran. So they're not much different. When you're studying complex systems, the very first rule you need to know is the system is always greater than the sum of its parts. So you cannot really understand the whole system by focusing on individual parts of it, because the combinations can be something very confusing and very complex, and that is something to note. In studying Iran, we have to note that. When studying Iran's politics or any other sorts of problem, we have to understand that. But when it comes to natural resources, it's the same thing. Whether we are talking about Iran or anywhere else, water human systems are very complex. Even the water system, the hydrologic system, the natural one, without the presence of humans, is very complex. But you add human to the problems, it becomes something very confusing, and we have a hard time understanding what is happening. And if I'm in a system like this, depending on which node I sit on, where I start from, my understanding and my narrative and my analysis might be different. But water in a real world is just a small, tiny piece of something much, much bigger and complex, which has other also environmental components. Sometimes we talk about those. When we talk about water, we talk about food, we talk about hydropower and energy and other things, and of course the environment. But the real system, if you want to analyze water problems, you have to understand that you cannot really dive into the complex water system and ignore the economy, political economy, defense system, the priorities of the system, like, housing and lots of other things involved. So if I only focus on water, my stories can be very different. If I only focus on the environment and ignore everything else, my stories can be very different. And unfortunately, we see a lot of that when it comes to the interpretations of the problems in the Middle East, like, the impact of drought on the Syrian crisis, the impact of climate change on the Arab Spring, and the impact of drought and water shortage on water protests. So we got to understand that we are dealing with a system which is complex, and it becomes even more complex when you superimpose human systems, politics, and so on. And if you don't pay attention to this delicate issue, then you would be part of that, conspiracy theory production campaign. And I warn us about this because our narratives really matter. Some of us have microphones, some of us have cameras, some of us have news outlets, like media outlets, and have a louder voice, and we can establish narratives, including the people who write for the media about Iran. And these narratives that you produce would affect judgments of different people. Look at what happened in Afghanistan after 20 years. Did we ever understand Afghanistan as it was? Look at the narratives that we produce at every stage about the ongoing problems, about the achievements, about the failures, and where are we seeing this coming? Now, whether you're interpreting how the downing of PS 752 with Iran, if it's a water problem, if it's a political issue, if it's a nuclear game of Iran, all of these problems are real complex. So we are responsible for the narratives that we produce. And it is very hard to be right. It's very hard to explain complexity to people. It's very hard to say the things that people don't like to hear, because once these narratives are established, you just repeat them and people like them and they come after you. I can point you to a lot of articles about Iran's problems that are not valid, at least in my field of expertise. Like in 2017, New York Times wrote an article which connected the protests in Iran to water shortage. And if the protests back then were in the wet season. No one in Iran necessarily goes on a protest for water unavailability in that season, but that was something that was told and later on appeared in many other places. CNN recently did a coverage. So there are tons of examples, and fortunately, a lot of people also react to these things these days. But it is hard to say the things that people don't like to hear. If you say the Syrian crisis was caused by a drought, a lot of people like you. You get likes and clicks, and you get invited to give speeches. And if you want to present the real complexity, you don't get attention. But that's a choice to make. And I think those in science at least need to remain objective and factual about what they say. Now, with that with this intro, I would say, then what am I going to do here? What is the answer to today's question? And if when I'm dealing with a problem with this magnitude, the drivers are too many. Even the title, I picked three that we hear a lot on media, but the causes are much more. Now, when the causes are too many, you can again single out things and just say the things that you like or you like the people to hear, and disregard other things. But there's also something very important, that the weight of these things are different. And if you want to address the problem, understanding these weights matter. So in a complex problem, the very first thing you learn in complex systems analysis is that you should never ever try to search for one single cause of a problem and a single solution for the problem, because you're dealing with a combination of lots of things and you need a portfolio of solutions to address the problem. So let's go through the problem, a little bit of background of Iran for those who are not familiar with Iran's nature, hydrology, and all these things. The very first thing is that Iran is pretty big. Is really large. So you cannot really necessarily compare it with the countries in the south of the Persian Gulf, or with Israel, or with some other small countries in that part of the world. So when you are talking about what is happening, you have to understand the size of the country you're talking about. And that size comes with a lot of variability across the country. We are very proud of the temperature variability in Iran. Within 1 hour, you can go from, you can pick something cooler, something warmer. You can decide if you want to ski and go to the beach and get sunburn. So that is get tan. That's the decision you can make because of that temperature variability, elevation variability, and so on. South of Iran is hot and humid, and north of Iran, in mountain areas, which are greener here, the temperature is generally lower. So remember these colors, and as we are going through a series of maps, which are going to be interesting. So on top of that, we have precipitation variability. So water availability is not the same across Iran. It's not the same. Water availability in New York is not the same as California. So it's not the same as Florida, Texas, and so on. So we have the same situation in a place like Iran, which is pretty big. Now, the country, the average of the country, the average precipitation is somewhat lower than 250 millimeters, but most of the country receive much less than this amount. Near the Caspian coast in the north, we get a lot of rain. That's the highest precipitation we'd receive. We have some precipitation in the west of the country, again, the high elevation zones, but a large area of Iran is not receiving a lot of water. Now, combine high temperature with water unavailability or with precipitation, then we should note that in Iran, the evaporation is quite high. So the water which comes even from the skies would not remain there for the Iranians. It gets evapotranspirated through, from the soil or from the plants. So Iran's water availability is very restricted. It's naturally that way in that part of the world. Now, compared to the rest of the region, if we are comparing Iran with the Middle Eastern countries, Iran is good in terms of water availability. If you compare, don't compare it with Turkey or even Lebanon, but it's, per capita water availability in Iran is good. But what matters is this variability across the nation. Add to this another complexity, and that is temporal variability of water. When do you get this water? Does it rain all the year, or is it going to be just one or two seasons? So Iran has a climate. So the water year just started. In the fall, we get some rain. In the winter, in some areas, we get snow, and then we have the summer is early spring, some raining. Summer is quite dry. So 75% of water, falls off season when people don't really want it for agriculture, which is quite big in Iran. 90% of water is being allocated to the agricultural sector. Now, another level of complexity. So water availability is different. Temperature is different. Now, the soil also doesn't have the same characteristics. So how much water, the budget of water can yield different, I would say, kilograms or like tonnage of crops in different places because the soil quality is different. Not everywhere in the country is suitable for agriculture, even though Iran is doing a lot of agriculture everywhere. But you see that in the areas that Iran has for agriculture are very limited. When we overlay water with soil quality, elevation, all these things together, we realize that only a very small percentage of Iran has a very suitable land for agriculture. That is in the north, and unfortunately, Iran is losing that land to housing development because people like to migrate there or buy houses close to the Caspian coast, including the people who live in Tehran and like to travel to the north. And then west of Iran is somewhat good. Some parts, including, for example, Iran, Khuzestan, some areas of it are not good actually for agriculture. Central Iran is not necessarily good. So if you're growing your crops here, the amount of resources you need to use or the amount of damage can be higher than other places. So that puts you at an unequal or uneven, I would say, situation. So there are advantages and disadvantages. But now add another layer of complexity to this. Where are people located? Are they close, in the places that have a lot of water, or did they choose to go, to different places? There is some overlap in some areas, like, if you look at it, generally people are in, the west of the country, mostly, but we also have central Iran, which has a lot of huge population. We have northeast Iran, which has a lot of, huge population. Tehran, for example, the capital is in a dry area. It has a huge population. Plus, Iran has a very high urban population, more than 70%. And out of this, most people have gone and chosen a few metropolitans and have gone there, and then we don't have many medium-sized cities. So the population distribution is also not good. Add to this another complexity, which is I belong to the baby boom generation, born in 1981, right after the revolution. Population of Iran within 2 decades after the revolution got doubled, and then that imposed additional constraints on the country, or pressure on the country, because my generation not only needed school, jobs, education, and all that, but also food, water, and so on. So that is another problem. Now, if you have all these complexities, and then you have people located in different places who want to have jobs, they want to grow food, you can't provide all of them with jobs everywhere, and the easiest thing to do is, of course, employing people in the agriculture sector. But another thing you do is when water availability is not desirable, you try to engineer the system. So you outsmart or control the natural system by using your talents. And that's what we engineers have been doing or promoting. So one of the easiest solutions for doing this is building dams. The Persians lived in that part of the world, relying on groundwater and canals for many years, but modernization came with that. Population growth and economic growth came, and all of these together, that meant that Iranians needed water. So with that, they got access to technology, including pumps and well digging, technologies for digging well. And then also building dams, inspired by the developments in the West. The Iranians also started building dams, and very soon, actually, within a few decades, when a lot of countries gave up on dam building in the West, Iranians were quite interested, and they became one of the top 3 dam builders in the world. I mean, dams became the symbol of development, symbol of pride when the country felt it was under pressure, wanted to become independent. Then plus construction is always an easy way of creating jobs, like investment in construction. So it made a lot of people happy in the short run. But if you increase the storage level on your rivers, then there is an easy mass balance. You would face problems if you restrict water flows going into lakes, into wetlands, into gulfs and seas and so on. Then you would face problems, drying wetlands, saltwater intrusion, and you name it. These are the problems which were created by this sort of action. Now, a lot of people like to blame these problems on droughts. Yes, if you have a drought, of course, water storage would fall and you would face problems. But let's look at Lake Rumia. In a recent study that we did, we looked at Lake Rumia to see what was happening. Droughts were real. Droughts have been in Iran for a long, long time. Floods as well. These things existed before we exist there. Humans choose Iran for living, or Persia for living. But the problem here is that what we saw was that the amount of the land area under cultivation, so farm areas around Lake Rumia increased over the years, even though water availability in some years was dropping. So that means that regardless of water unavailability or water availability fluctuations, surface water availability, Iranians have been, have continued to form and expand the agricultural sector. And this is not, this is not restricted to Lake Rumi. Another study last year that we did shows that rain-fed agriculture in Iran did not change much in terms of its size, but irrigated agriculture continued to grow. So this is the area of cultivation. So of course, technology was helpful, and then yield went up, and things got better. And you can see that there was a sharp growth in the yield, but the area under cultivation also increased. Now, with that, I'm going to say that you cannot blame all this problem on droughts or climate change immediately, because even if we consider climate change real, that I think we should, even if we believe that water availability has become more limited because of less precipitation or change in the pattern of precipitation, that's something to debate, because there are different elements of complexity that we need to discuss when it comes to that side of the problem. What we see here is that aside from the stressors of natural stressors, or what the natural system has done to us, we have continued to operate regardless. This is like a person who doesn't have salary but keeps his or her expenditure high, and that is what we did. Iranians, like many other nations, use the engineering approach. The way we solve problems in the water sector, still this is the case, the energy sector, elsewhere, is that we see a problem, we choose our desired state, we want to change the situation, that defines our problem. So let's say water unavailability. I want to live in Isfahan. What do? There is no water. I go build a dam. I go transfer water. I build a desalination plant, whatever. So I make a decision. I alter the environment, and I think the problem is solved. This is how we train our students. This is how we think. This is what we do still in engineering and natural science, unfortunately. So whether it's dams, digging a deeper well, or transferring water, or desalination, or taking water out of sky, we focus on increasing the supply and addressing the shortage problem. So it doesn't matter, recycling and reuse, irrigation efficiency improvement, all of these can have the same impact. Let's look at the impact of this sort of thinking, which we call linear thinking in complex science, in complexity and system science. Let's see what the impact is. An example of this, which is similar to other parts of the world which have experienced water transfer, like California, has happened. So an example has happened in Iran. So let's look at this case in Iran. Zayanderud River Basin, for a long time, for decades, Iranians had the idea of transferring water from another location, from the tributaries of the famous Karun River, which flows into Khuzestan, and you recently probably heard about the problems related to it. What was specific about Zayanderud River Basin, central Iran, former capital of Iran, quite populated, high urban population, high agricultural demand. It was the second industrial zone of the country, or province in the country, had important, significant environmental elements, including a wetland preserved under the Ramsar Convention, high population growth. But then over the years, water transfer projects were implemented one after another. One reason for that was also a strength of the politicians from that part of the world, or decision makers from that part of the world, or their presence within the central government. So politically strong people managed to also get a lot of projects approved. But the problem was that this beautiful river, Zayanderud River, that every Iranian has a feeling for, like Lake Urumia, looks like this most of the year. And the question is, even if, what has happened? Because when we look at the basin, there have been lots of water transfer projects proposed, one after another. Some of these have already been implemented and have more than doubled the natural flow of the river. The river keeps flowing. There is a reservoir in upstream, and then it goes through cities, and then lots of huge agricultural area, heavy agricultural use, and it eventually flows into a wetland. The wetland is dry, the river is dry, and right now the reservoir doesn't have enough water. It's a miracle that this year, this summer is over, and the city of Isfahan didn't do worse than this. Now, water transfer comes with a lot of issues. People in the recipient basin become dependent on it, and anytime there is fluctuations in water availability, there are strikes, there are conspiracy theories, they get mad, there are protests. But also in the donor basin, which used to be wet and had a high water availability, people are mad. The environmental injustice bothers them because they don't have enough water available even for them, for their wetlands, for their cattle. They face dust storms. There are lots of environmental problems. So now, how are you going to solve this problem? In California, we have a similar situation. In the Colorado Basin, we have a similar situation. People establish rights to something. They expect it to be available, and once you take it from them, they get angry, and they have every right to be that way. Now, let's see what has happened. The general mentality that we have had was, solving the problem through engineering approaches. Water is scarce. What do? I build a dam, or I transfer water. It's something that increases my water supply, and no matter how much it costs, I bring all the engineering talents together to solve the problem. I increase water supply, and then I think the problem is solved. What I don't pay attention to, because I'm an engineer, not a social scientist, not an economist, is that by increasing water supply with some delay, this is a delay mark, there would be watershed development. I increase the perception of water availability. I promote and facilitate development in that region, which is water short, where people should not be placed necessarily, like the city of Los Angeles. So people keep coming to that place, more jobs, good quality of life, and the water demand goes up. So I brought water to solve the water shortage problem, but by bringing that water, I promoted development, the water demand just increased even further. And that's what we saw with every tunnel. We saw, a drop in water shortage, but soon after things went back on. And this is what, in 2005, I started modeling this system, and this is what I faced. Back then, it was a new finding and very counterintuitive, but right now, a lot of people, fortunately, in Iran talk about it and consider this, are very familiar with this archetype that we call fix that backfires, which focuses on, treating the symptom rather than addressing the main cause. So it ignores the unintended consequences. You got pain in your body because of an infection or COVID-19, and you just disregard it. You take painkillers, your pain goes away, your infection gets worse and worse, and eventually your body would collapse. The same thing here, that if I don't control the mechanisms for water demand growth, then my symptom management just makes, puts me in a worse situation. And that is this situation in Iran, almost in every sector. That is what we do. That is what the country is doing. Because once it gets, late in the game, if you continue this behavior for a while, then you get stuck in it, because then you don't have enough resources to deal with all your problems. If one problem gets really bad, then you go and put a Band-Aid on it. You treat the symptom and then hope and pray that it won't come back. So this linear thinking must be, of course, replaced with nonlinear thinking, and we have to consider what can happen when we do this. And if we do so, then our attitude would be different. So for those who, for example, if they talk about Iran, they immediately say, oh, Iran must increase its irrigation efficiency and drip irrigation would solve Iran's problems. I want to remind them that this is it's exactly the very same way. So if you increase water availability, if you increase irrigation efficiency, what happens is that farmers find access to more water. So if they find access to more water, they grow more food, or they grow more crops, they expand their agricultural area. And what happens is that water consumption goes up, because you also lose your recharge or return flows, because right now when you have flood irrigation, some of the water returns into your your springs, your surface water, or percolates down and it goes into the groundwater. So same thing, again, another example of reductionist thinking in the West about Iran's problems. That there's a report out of Duke, I think a few years ago, and that is the suggestion they're making. So not that irrigation efficiency is bad. No, I'm not saying technology is bad. I'm an engineer, but technology must be combined with other things, with enough rules and regulations and good, legal, I think, mechanism, good governance mechanism if you want to solve the problem. Now, if you can reduce water consumption and relocate people to different places, change your water use from one sector to another, you can address this problem and benefit from irrigation efficiency or even dams and water transfer. If you don't, if you continue business as usual in Iran, this is what you see. The outcome is exactly what you're saying. But the problems of Iran are not restricted to surface water. Surface water is like your checking account. It gets renewed by the nature, you use it, and when you're short, you go to your saving account. The saving account of Iran is groundwater that we inherited from our ancestors. What have we done to our groundwater? We have continuously used it because there was not enough surface water. When there is a drought, people switch to groundwater. When there is water shortage, people switch to groundwater because their crops, their farms need water and they're thirsty. So as a result, in some areas, remember the northeast, the dry northeast, for example, central Iran, all these places, Tehran, these places that I named, groundwater level is really low. So when groundwater level goes down, you get sinkholes, you get land subsidence, the quality of water changes. You spend a lot of energy, use a lot of energy to pump that water out. And if you're in a country like Iran, where energy is cheap, then drought and more water use means more energy demand, like what we saw in Iran in a recent drought, that not only we didn't have enough water for producing hydropower in the dams, but through the dams, what we also had seen an increase in energy use for groundwater. So extra energy use means more subsidies being paid to this sector, being given for this bad behavior. And the only thing you don't want to do is you don't want to cut all those things. You don't want to make the farmers angry. So as a result, you pay people, you give subsidies to people to continue farming and pumping groundwater and destroying the aquifers. And then also groundwater quality drops and it becomes unusable for many, many purposes. So then you face a lot of groundwater basin across the country, which are in a terrible situation. Iran is not alone in that game. We see the situation in India. We see in some parts of the same problem, parts of China, West United States, Mexico, lots of other problems with the same thing. Now, can we expect Iran to save this problem? When we talk about the problems of Iran in the water and environmental sector, they're very similar to the problems we saw in the West in the 70s or 80s, like green movements, environmental awareness goes up, people start questioning the suitability or sustainability of engineering solutions, and then they establish environmental rights, and the fight continues, of course, like what is happening right now in the West. But at least there would be some environmental improvements. A lot of people, when they talk about Iran or think about Iran, including myself, like many years ago, think that these situations are similar and Iran can address the problem. But this is not true, because at least at this point in time, because the socioeconomic context in the Middle East is very different. This context, like what the quality of, I would say, the strength of the economy over there, the model of the economic development, economic model, and everything, the setup that the countries have over there is different. So they would not be necessarily able to address the problems like the Americans did, for example, when they faced a Dust Bowl, or when they saw some wetlands going dry. Even here, we have not been able to solve those problems completely. But something that I use and for public policy prioritization, like how do people behave and how do they choose which problems to address first? I mean, this is the Eisenhower box. It's not mine, but in public policy, it's something that I've not seen people using it. I think it has, it can simply explain what we do and how we choose which problems to address. I have 4 years in office. I have 8 years in office. I'm 4 years in parliament. What do I do? So resources are limited. So I go for the problems which the society and myself consider both relatively important and relatively urgent. Both relatively important and relatively urgent. Where is water? So even if we say it is very important and so it's relatively speaking, it is not considered urgent by most people. So it falls in an area that we talk about water, cheap talk, plan for it, let's do something for it in the long run. For it to go to the area, space where it becomes critical, it becomes a public concern, it becomes something that everyone is speaking about. We need the situation that we had in Khuzestan. We need serious and visual things, unfortunately. So extreme events are the ones which get us think about water. It's not only Iran, it's also the rest of the world. So that is why a lot of regulations are passed and a lot of mandates come when there is an extreme event. Following an extreme event, there is a window of opportunity to take action. Now, if you are in a country like Iran, that extreme events are happening on a daily basis in every sector, that window of opportunity is very short for you. So people very fast forget what happened in Khuzestan and move on to the next problem and next problem and next problem. So you see public anger being expressed for a short period, and the government knows this very well. So you do anger management, you suppress, depending on the situation, you make a decision about how to control it. Now, globally speaking, environment is in the same position. Now, climate change is something that we are promoting more than other environmental problems, unfortunately, I would say, because this is a questionable behavior. But we are campaigning, we're spending money and all of that. But even climate change is not the top priority for governments and for the general public. This was not the case for the COVID-19. Why? Because COVID-19 was killing us. Everyone took action on it. And every government didn't take action on it until it reached its territory and it started killing people. So for people to pay attention to climate change or environmental problems, then we use any opportunity that we see, or we take advantage of any evidence that we think would be convincing to people. So if it's a wildfire, there is a wildfire in Canada, we blame it on climate change. If it's a flood in Germany and Belgium, we blame it on climate change. If it's a protest in Iran related to water, we blame it on climate change. We climatize everything because we want to increase the urgency, relative urgency within the society. Now, this can have some advantages as long as you are truthful, as long as you're not lying, because people would lose their trust. If you climatize everything, every event, then you miss the reality that floods in New York came. Yes, climate change could have played a role, but the fact is that you have a lot of people living in basements and you have built houses and you didn't think about those things. This is a mismanagement issue. In Germany, yes, you can say climate change had a role, but you didn't do evacuations properly. You sent alerts, but then you didn't do evacuations properly. So that people were affected. So there is a big element there that if we are reductionists, we drop that important element. And that's a gift to people in the Middle East, because they can immediately say that, or even the developing world, politicians and decision makers love it because you say it's climate change. Guess who created climate change? It wasn't us, it was the Westerners, and they got to fix it. We couldn't have done anything for that. I'm arguing that mismanagement is a big thing. And if you don't pay attention to this matter, then the situation would be what can get worse, and our narratives are actually counterproductive and not constructive and not helpful to those people, because with the narratives that we are issuing and developing, we kind of make the decision makers respond. They are not liable. They don't shoulder the blame for what is happening in Iran. Climate change is not a serious thing for for both the government and the decision makers. Environmental problems, people pay attention to it. There is an environmental awareness in Iran. Water is something that most Iranians know is important, but again, compared to other things, it's not the most pressing factor. Now, one thing is what is happening at the societal level, and what is the other thing is what is happening for the governments and what are their priorities. So both urgent and important when it comes to defense, when it comes to other matters. The relative importance and urgency of these matters for the government is much more. Another thing is if there are protests, if people are unhappy, that's something that you're afraid of, for any reason. You can suppress, you can, but as long as people are expressing things, people are getting into protests, you get nervous. So for that, if water is the main cause of that, or one of the causes of your protest, what do? It's the situation that we recently had. If you want to address water problems, it's going to take a long time, and by the time you might not even exist in office. What do? Are you going to cut subsidies? Are you going to price water properly? Are you going to charge for the true price of food? Are you going to charge for pollution? Or are you going to just feed people and make sure that they're not going to get angry? You control their anger and you continue doing business as business as usual in the past, because you don't want people to get angry. Now, if you want to solve this problem in Iran, you have to decrease the reliance of Iran's economy on water. So agriculture is making jobs, is creating jobs for the Iranians. Plus, the Islamic Republic, like some other countries, has concerns, valid concerns, and to an extent a paranoia about food insecurity. So it wants to produce food at home, and they have had slogans of food self-sufficiency. And for that matter, these things, food and people having jobs become much more important than sustainability of the environment and environmental matters. And unless there is a big crisis, and for that, if we are in a crisis for some period, everyone speaks about the crisis. As soon as it's over, then people forget. Now, are there solutions? We are hearing lots of things. Yes, there are solutions, but there is no quick fix. You cannot solve this problem overnight, even if you throw the regime away, it doesn't matter. You cannot solve this problem that has been created over decades through bad management, lack of foresight, and all that overnight. It takes a while to do things. But how do you do that? As I said, you reduce the pressure of the economy on natural resources and water. You make sure that you find jobs for people in alternative sectors, because right now a lot of people are dependent on the agricultural sector, and we have a lot of subsistence farmers actually farming to survive. So that job creation through using water is more important than food production through using water for the country. So that is something we need to change. Iran needs to diversify its economy. Now it's questionable, we got to question if Iran can do that when it has chosen to be under sanction or pursue its policies in a way that that it has been doing for a long time. Now, another thing is admitting that this problem exists, not just calling it a crisis, like we can mitigate and fix it. No, a lot of these damages are irreversible, and the Iranians need to admit the failure and adapt to the new situation and the new normal, if you will. Raising awareness, of course, helps with creating this sense of urgency for the people. And of course, even Iran or elsewhere, even within dictatorships, democracies, dictatorships everywhere, the rulers and the governments care about what people think. I mean, because that creates pressure for them. They might manipulate them, they might control their thinking and mentality, but what people think and what they find urgent and important matters. So if you raise awareness, there is a chance to change these things or this trend. But the other thing is is empowering the farmers. Right now, Iranians have subsidized the farmers for a long time. Farmers have continued to get in a worse shape, of course, through subsidies, through lots of things. Their livelihood might have got improved, but the agricultural sector has lost it has become more and more inefficient in terms of economic productivity. It's more damaging to the environment and biodiversity and ecosystem. And the farmers are not part of the decision-making process. So empowering the farmers and giving them more power can help with the process of fair use of water, promoting environmental justice in the country, and sharing the burden together. So, but it's a dare matrix. So I don't think the government will choose to do this when it's suffering from lots of other problems. So I think we will see a brick wall, strategy that you continue business as usual until physics actually stop you. So 2 papers that I've done, one with colleagues in 2016 and one in 2014, might be your interest because it talks about the root causes and I would say the solutions in detail. You can have a look at those or email me later if you have questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that really engaging and rich conversation and presentation. So we got a lot of questions from the audience, and we only have a little bit less than 10 minutes to go. So I have a lot of questions for you, Kaveh, but I can always reach you. So I'm going to focus on the audience questions in order to give them an ability to pose the questions that they had. So because of time, if it's okay with you, I'll pose like 2 at a time, and then you answer however you would like. So one question is, can you please elaborate a little bit more on the situation of Khuzestan itself? And then another question is, are there any comprehensive water conservation law projects proposed in the parliament in Iran, or is it more ad hoc or not addressed at all?
I start from the latter. So like other things, like when there is a pressing situation, people come and make promises. Like the new, for example, Minister of Energy, Minister of Water and Power came with a plan. But if you look at the plan, there are promises about addressing all problems together, building more dams while addressing water shortage issues. And so these are in conflict with each other. So I don't think there is any effective plan in place for addressing the problems. I think water use will continue to rise if physics allow. In some places, for example, in different groundwater basins, now what we are seeing is that groundwater use has flattened or stopped. This is not because of better regulation, but in most places, but because of the physics of the system. It's not cost effective to pump any more water, or the water is so salty or the quality is so low that it's useless. Unfortunately, there is nothing in place, neither for water or other sectors. There are here and there are ad hoc things as you mentioned. Now, for Khuzestan, the Khuzestan is water bankrupt essentially. It's an example of where ecosystem would eventually collapse because there is too much pressure on it. Unlike central Iran, Khuzestan is a wet region. Actually, it's rich in terms of available water. It has the biggest and longest river of Iran. It has many dams because of that reason. It produces a lot of power, hydropower for the rest of the country, active agriculture and all that. So if you build dams to produce power, if you have placed a lot of industries there, placed a lot of agricultural lands there, and I've also taken water out of it for other places and are not providing water to the wetlands and farmers, then people would have good reasons to express their anger. Now, this is something to note here. These protests might start with a water excuse, with an environmental excuse, but soon after, they're no longer an environmental protest, because people just need something which justifies their, the expression of anger. And environment is one of the very best causes, or most justified causes in a place like Iran, for coming to streets. But soon after, people, it's accumulated anger and accumulated dissatisfaction for lots of different reasons. So in Khuzestan, for example, the environmental injustice element, or the injustice element in general, was a big factor. Different ethnic groups were correctly complaining about systematic problems or discrimination, if you will. There were also people who didn't have, farmers who didn't have water. There were in the governor of Khuzestan just a few weeks before the incident said that that there is no city in Khuzestan which has clean tap water. This is despite the fact that government claims that 99.9% of urban water is clean, and that's like more than 70% of the population across the country. But this is what the governor says. A lot of rural areas there don't have access to clean water, even in regular times, normal times. So they get water with tankers and all that. For a lot of us ignorance, let's say, like, myself, who grew up in Tehran, we might be unfamiliar with these things. And when they come to the news, we think it's a recent thing. But lots of these things have existed, and still exist in many places in Iran. And then people at some point get angry. We have seen this in the past also over dust storms, for example, in Khuzestan. Now, when people come out for environmental matters, you can, still we saw suppression, we saw people getting killed, but it's not as easy, to handle the case as, for example, if they're mad for any sort of political matter, if they're, angry for election, fraud, possible fraud, in election, whatever. But this is also very important. And you saw like some also lack of correlation between the places where water problem was most acute and where people were out or things were happening. And that shows to us that this is an accumulated anger problem, not necessarily the water shortage. So water shortage can act as a trigger and ignite. So the house is already on fire and you just need, some fuel to see the big fire.
Thank you for that. I'm going to throw a few more than 2 questions at you, just given our time. So one audience member asked, what stops Iran from harvesting solar energy? Is solar energy an environmentally sustainable source for Iran or not? Another audience member asks, I think you addressed this, but I'll ask it anyway. And if you have, you don't have to address it in the answer. But for good management of water resources in Iran, must there be a change in management or the way that they're managed, or a change in water governance methods, or both? And then the last question that we have is, in the January 2018 New York Times op-ed, I think it's the one that you mentioned earlier.
Actually, yes.
The audience member asked, it was pointed out that bad management had forced many farmers to migrate to slums and shanty towns. The op-ed was published before the spring rainfalls. The 30 plus people killed in December 2017 were from regions hit by water shortage. So I think they were asking in reference to what you had been mentioning.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for correcting me. The conversion from the Iranian dates to yeah. So I back then, actually, I was in office. Hopefully this question is not, or hopefully it comes from the person who wrote it. I remember that the journalist who wrote this contacted me and asked questions from me through email, and the questions were so off that I said, why don't you go and read these articles, or and I sent many links before answering the question. Of course, we want the person to do their job, her job before coming to you. And she writes back to me and says, I've already read your article. And I was like, which article? I have so many, and I'm sending so many links. And I thought she's not willing to do her job, and I'm not going to waste my time. And if you see that article, just so you know how how bad it is I'm quoted there as a university teacher or professor, lecturer, whatever, not as a person in office. As well, my boss at the time, vice president, head of the Department of Environment, gets quoted as a former minister over there. So that shows you how factual things are. Now, the thing about this thing that you mentioned, that in this had happened in cities with water shortage, or like where farmers were, that's actually my first slide. Correlation, statistical correlation doesn't mean causation. Simply because you have farmers in those places doesn't mean that the cause is water shortage. Why not other things? If you look at Iran, in many places where you have water shortage issues, you have also health issues. You have like education issues. That's why we say this systematically. We are seeing hotspot. We are seeing places with problems. Now, how would you narrow this down to water unavailability? And those of us who were in Iran back then, at least, or those even who analyzed Iran, any Iranian, I think, would not associate that problem with water shortage. That protest, and Nargis, correct me if I'm wrong, and if you have seen people attributing that particular the protest back then to water. Now, the question about water management and water governance, these are interlinked and interdependent. So it's, without changing in the water governance structure and methods, you won't see any change in the attitude of those who try to solve the problem, the engineers, the managers, and so on. And solar energy, okay, so what stops the United States from using solar panel for to supply the energy? First thing is, how much can you produce, and how much your demand is, and is there can you match the two? Second is, what is the opportunity cost? How much should I pay for doing this? If I have a limited budget, will I go for this energy, or will I go for something cheaper? If a country is sitting on natural gas, should it go for solar energy or not, when there are some other things that the country is struggling with? The Europeans have the issue of energy insecurity, have had it for many years. For them, when they do the cost-benefit analysis, things are very different from a country which is sitting on oil and gas, of course, or the United States, which is pretty big. Another thing which you need to remember is the complexity. So Iran also has nights, right? So solar energy, yes, good, increase its share in the portfolio, but what are you going to do at night when there's no solar energy, right? And then we're in places where dust is, have plenty of dust. Energy production through solar panels is not easy. So that mentality that you see sun and some desert, and then you think, okay, this country can export solar energy in a few years, that's not real, at least at this point in history. And when you choose energy sources for different countries, you have to look at their available resources and their whether financial or natural, and see what is good for them. At the end, we need a mix of different energy sources, and for sure, solar energy can be part of that for you.
Thanks so much. So we're getting a lot of other questions, but we're over our time.
Sorry to interrupt. I just use this example as well, because so sad actually, but people as the example of we in the global north having reductionist images of what is happening in that part of the world. People decided to give solar panels to the Afghan farmers to empower them. Sustainable, and it's really good. You want to create jobs and everything, and food. What happened in Afghanistan? Solar panels were given to the farmers, and they started taking water out of the aquifer. First thing is, you dig too many wells, you see the problems you saw in Iran. Groundwater level goes down. Tragedy of the commons created. It affected the water flowing into Iran, surface water, because surface water and groundwater are connected. So more conflicts with the Iranians. But what did the farmers do with the solar energy? They grow poppy. So as a result, there was no shortage of opium and heroin, and all of these problems were solved. But food security problems were not addressed. you see what's happening in Afghanistan today. The empowerment didn't work, and the solution was not sustainable. Only because it's solar and you don't see any smoke or greenhouse gas emissions immediately doesn't mean that it's sustainable. We have to consider all factors.
Thank you for that. So we do see the other questions that folks are posing, and I wish that we could go and continue to pose those for Dr. Madani, but I think that this just means we have to have you again, Kaveh. And so hopefully we'll be able to invite you on again, because a lot of people are very interested in the work that you do. I do encourage those who are watching, if you haven't already, please do read Dr. Madani's work, both his scientific publications as well as a lot of the public engagement work that he does, in order to continue following along with what he's engaging with. And you saw his social media handles at the beginning of the presentation. We'll also include those in our report back on all of this as we post everything on our social media as well, so you can connect with Dr. Madani there. We want to really thank you so much for this really excellent presentation and all the richness that you brought to this discussion. And we're always a fan of making things more complex, even though that doesn't make anything easier. So thank you so much, Dr. Madani. Thank you all for joining us. We hope to see you all on Monday, October 4th at 12 p.m. Eastern Time for our conversation with Bijan Khwajapour and Esfandiar Badmangladich about the future of Iran's economic and political engagement with the world. Thanks so much.
Thank you, and thank you. I should also thank the people behind the scenes who did all the coordination. Thank you so much, and thank you all who connected from different places.